Greetings and welcome to another one of our special editions of Slant Alpha Adventures. Today we're going to be talking about filing your VATSIM flight plan using the web-based interface. Now, why are we talking about that right now? Well, there's a pretty substantial change coming up to the network as of the time that I'm speaking here and producing this video, which we'll talk about in just a moment. We're going to start by going over some background information. What exactly is changing here? When is it changing? And why is it changing? We'll go over the basics, meaning what do I absolutely need to know in order to accommodate this change. Third, we'll go over the ICAO equipment codes, and we'll talk about how they're different than the single-letter FAA code that you might be using up until now. And then finally, we'll go over some advanced stuff that you really don't need to know, but there's 16 different fields at the bottom of this flight plan page. You don't need to fill them out, but you might be interested to know what goes in there. We'll talk about it. You can decide whether or not you want to use that information. Okay, so what's exactly changing here? Well, starting really soon, it's no longer going to be possible to file a flight plan directly from your pilot client app. We're looking at vPilot here, and you've got this little button here that says flight plan, and this pop-up window comes up, and you can fill in the flight details right there from the app. What's happening real soon is that this flight plan button is going to redirect you to the web-based filing page. As a matter of fact, all present and future clients, once this change is fully enacted, will redirect you to that web-based filing page. Now, note that if you're filing through SimBrief and other outside apps, nothing is changing for you. What other outside apps even do it? Does Volanta do it? I have no idea. Sim Toolkit Pro, does that even still a thing? I have no idea. But SimBrief being the primary one, if you file through SimBrief, nothing changes for you. You can still do that. When is this change being enacted? Well, if you're an X-Plane user, 2 years ago. They took the in-app flight plan window away from XPilot in early 2022, maybe late 2021. I'm not sure exactly when it was, but about 2 years ago as of the time that I'm producing this tutorial. vPilot is going away days from now as I'm speaking now. So we're producing this tutorial just a few days in advance of March 24 rather. And that is when the next update to vPilot is going to take away this flight plan window up here. If you're on Swift, which is the third pilot client, I have no idea when that's changing. It may already have, or it may be soon. I don't know. Not too many use it, but it is a more cross-platform pilot client, and eventually they're all going to redirect to the web-based filing page. Likewise. Now, why is this change happening? I'll be honest. I'm kind of disappointed about this, but I do understand the reasoning why, and I'll explain it in these terms. So, VATSIM's server infrastructure is maintained by a volunteer group of developers. The pilot clients, these three pilot clients, XPilot, vPilot, Swift, are also maintained by different groups of volunteer developers. So whenever VATSIM wants to make a change to the flight sim protocol on the network, there's 4 different groups of volunteer developers that have to be involved. And as you can imagine, getting 4 different groups of volunteers who all have their own day jobs and don't do any of this programming for VATSIM for a living, all have to get together and enact this change at the same time. So from now on, once this change is enacted and once all of the clients just simply direct to the web page, any future changes to the flight plan format can just be made on the web page, and they affect everybody equally at the same time, instantly, without having to do all that coordination between people all over the world. So I get it. I don't like it, but I get it. Now, before we go any further, this tutorial is going to assume you've already done a handful of things. First of all, you've already decided what your call sign is going to be and what type of aircraft you're going to fly. Secondly, you know where you're starting, where you're going, and how you're getting there. Third, you know how long it's going to take you to get there, and therefore you know how much fuel it's going to take to load into your aircraft to get there with appropriate reserves. If you haven't done those things, pause the video, go figure that stuff out. I'll meet you back here in a minute. Okay, so here we are at the VATSIM web-based filing page. Now you'll notice in a lot of places it's referred to as the pre-filing page. It's fine. You can actually use this now while you're already connected to the network, as long as you're either parked, or if you're airborne, you can use it as long as you don't already have a flight plan filed that is associated with that call sign. So it'll still be called the pre-filing page in a lot of documentation. That's fine. This is the page they're referring to. The very first thing we're going to put in here is our call sign. Now, we just figured out what our call sign was going to be, so that's already done. If you need some assistance figuring out an appropriate call sign for the type of operation that you're doing, I already have a tutorial on my VATSIM tutorials playlist that kind of goes over this. So you can pause this video, go watch this one, and come back. One of the weird things, though, is that because we used to be filing all these through the pilot client never asked us for the call sign because it already knew. You were already connected with it. It knew what your call sign was. Now we're connecting in one place and we're filing in another. And those call signs have to match exactly, or else the controller's going to say, well, you're asking for IFR clearance. I don't have a flight plan on file for you. And you're going to be like, I filed it already. I don't know why you don't see it. This is probably the number one reason that happens. Let's just say you're going by a general aviation call sign. So you put in the registration, and here you put it in with the hyphen, but when you connected with the pilot client, you didn't put the hyphen. You shouldn't put the hyphen, but let's just assume that you accidentally did in one or the other. Those call signs don't match. It's not going to connect the flight plan with the call sign. So now that you have to enter the call sign someplace separately, it's just a side note. You have to make sure that you get it exactly the same on this page as you do in your pilot client when you connect to the network. Next thing we're going to do is talk about IFR or VFR. Hopefully by this point you know what those are. If you don't, you need to back up a couple steps. However, one side note to note here is that we also have what are called Yankee type flight plans and Zulu type flight plans. Basically, they start as one and then become the other, IFR versus VFR. Those are not options here. You're just going to connect, you're going to choose whichever one you're starting as, and that's the way that'll work. For aircraft type, you have to make absolutely certain that you're putting in a valid ICAO aircraft type code. How do you know? Well, here's what you do. Here's the ICAO's webpage. We'll go straight to the source. Can't get it wrong if you go right to the actual real-world ICAO. This is very simple. You can search by the manufacturer name or the model, whatever you want to put in. If we're flying as a Piper Comanche, well, you can just search through all the Pipers. Well, I didn't see it. There we go. So we know that a Comanche is a PA24. That's exactly what we should put in. So you can put any manufacturer model in here. You can narrow it down by number of engines or whatever you want to do. But use this page if you're not certain of the exact aircraft type that goes in here. Actually, let's back up a step because we're going to go Southwest 514 IFR, and we're going to be in a Boeing 737-700. Weight category. We never used to have to put this in. Now we do. So an extra step. However, nice thing about this this web page is it's got a drop down that tells us exactly which category is which based on the aircraft's maximum takeoff weight, MTOW. So not the weight that you are today, but the maximum takeoff weight that the type of aircraft is rated for. Problem is, these are listed in kilograms, and I'm a dumb Yank. So let's talk about the weight categories in terms of imperial units. That way us dumb Americans can all understand them. All right, so your light category is anything up to 15,500 pounds. That's going to be most of your single and twin engine general aviation aircraft. Okay, medium is anything more than 15.5 but less than 300,000 pounds. Now I've pictured a business jet here. However, even your regional jets and even some of your smaller airline categories of 737, A320 are all going to be in this medium weight category. Your heavies, anything 300,000 pounds or greater, that's going to be your 767, your 777, your 787, 747 clearly. I think Airbus makes a few heavies. I'm not really sure. No, I'm just kidding. I don't know the Airbuses that well, but I think it's the 300, the 330, the 340, and the 350 series are all pretty much your heavies. Check me on that, though. The only exception is it's 300,000 pounds or more, except any that are designated as a super. Now, if we go back to the web page, you'll notice that the only super it lists here on the drop-down is the A380-800 series. However, we know darn well that there are some legacy types that are also considered super and that aren't in that drop-down, but they are still valid on VATSIM. And we kind of figure if you're flying a super, you know who you are. But anyway, in our case, we're a 737-700. That's going to be a medium. Equipment code, for now, we're going to go with just the FAA code, and we're going to leave this transponder one blank. It says skip if you're using the FAA equipment code. We're going to use the single letter FAA code for now. I already have a tutorial on my VATSIM tutorials playlist that goes over these. You can check this out if you need it. The single letter specifies not only the navigation method, but also whether you're RVSM capable and what type of transponder you have. All of that is contained in a single letter, and that's why if you're going to use that, you would then skip the second field for putting in your transponder type. If you want to use the new ICAO code rather than the FAA single letter one, we'll come back to it, trust me. For right now, I'm just going to go with the FAA Lima code, which means that we have a transponder with mode Charlie capability, and we are RNAV with GNSS, meaning we have some sort of GPS associated with the navigation system, and that we are capable of RVSM, meaning that we can fly this aircraft at flight level 290 and higher. And again, we're going to skip this one. We're going to come back to this one once we talk about the ICAO version of the equipment codes. Departure, well, that's very easy. That's where you're starting from. Off block time, well, that's simply the time that you're going to be pushing back from the gate or rolling from the ramp to begin your flight. Now, with the old pilot client pages, I don't think it was ever really clear what departure time we were really putting in, and I believe that the tradition was generally to put in the wheels up time. My opinion is the off-block time works better. Now, a lot of times, unless it's a really busy event, VATSIM controllers are not really looking at this anyway, so it's not that super critical. However, in the case of the larger events, I do think that the off-block time is a little bit more useful because the wheels-up time assumes some things that you, as the pilot, don't really have control over, particularly in those busy events, such as the taxi time and taxi delays. Whereas the off-block time is a much more useful number to put in here because it indicates to the air traffic control team what time do you expect to be ready to push and get rolling. So we'll put that in there. Altitude, cruise altitude, yeah, that's pretty simple. Airspeed is in knots. This is in knots true airspeed, not indicated airspeed, by the way. If you don't know the difference, probably a good time to pause the video and read up on that. But anyway, what goes in here, and this is typical of this is same as the, this hasn't changed. So what goes in here is the true airspeed of the aircraft that you're going to be flying. Arrival, that's your destination. Just another way of saying the same thing. Alternate, again, that's your, that's the airport that you're going to plan fuel enough to divert to. This doesn't mean that you have to divert to that airport if for some reason you can't make it into your primary destination. This just indicates an airport that you've done appropriate fuel planning for. But once you get airborne, if you need to divert, then you're not limited to just what you've listed as your filed alternate. En route time, that's just hours and minutes that you plan to be airborne. And then fuel endurance, again, hours and minutes that you have on board in terms of available fuel. Route details is fairly simple. In case of this flight, fairly standard routing. U419 to JFK and then the Roebuck 3. So there we go. We are then going to skip down past these 16 fields. We're going to come back to that. These are the advanced fields that we're going to talk about. These are all optional, but I'm going to direct you to the bottom line here, the remarks field and the voice rules. The voice rules, there's three options: voice, receive voice, and text only. Most time, most folks on VATSIM are going to be selected under voice, and that means that you're talking over the air traffic control frequency and you're hearing the controller talk to you. There are some folks who they don't have a microphone or they're not allowed to speak because of the noise level in the household or whatever, so they can hear in their headset the controller talking to them, but when they respond they have to do so via text. That means you can receive voice, but you're not able to transmit back via voice. If you're not capable of it for hardware limitations or personal limitations, and you have to transmit and receive ATC instructions via text, this is how you would choose that. The remarks code, there's going to be a lot of additional information that should go in there depending on some things that we put in the equipment code and the transponder code in terms of the ICAO format. However, this is also something where like your live stream link can go if you wanted to. Live stream link or virtual airline link, or well, actually one that I'm going to show you here, RTF, is the proper way to specify a call sign for an airline that is either not well known or no longer operating or is fictional. So, pressing example, PAA. Most folks who really know aviation know that PAA is Pan American Airways, and Pan American was one that they had one of the more unique call signs, was Clipper. But for the younger folks who are on the network that might not know the history of Pan American, might not know the history of the call sign, this is a way you can specify that Clipper is the appropriate call sign for what you've listed up at the top there. Anyway, at that point, you're done. Everything else here is optional. Go ahead and hit the button. All right, let's circle back now and talk about the ICAO equipment codes. Earlier, we spoke of the single-letter FAA version, which specifies both the navigation and the transponder type that you have on board your aircraft. The ICAO equipment codes are much more descriptive in terms of the different types of equipment and the different types of capabilities, not only of your navigation and your transponder, but also of your radio communications, your voice communications. So we're going to go over that now. So first of all, the equipment, the first of those two fields, is going to cover both your communication and your navigation capabilities. In terms of your comm radios, the letter V indicates that you have your regular standard aviation VHF comm radios. That's the radios that operate in the band of 118 to 136 megahertz, the normal aviation communication range. Why do I have this in purple? We'll come back to that. The letter Y is the same as the above, but with 8.33 kilohertz spacing in between channels. What do we mean by that? Well, in the U.S., we're not really using these just yet. But outside of the U.S., there's a lot of places where we've had to compress the number of channels that are available in the comm range to avoid saturation. So they've spaced these, instead of by 25 kilohertz, which is what they do in the U.S., over there in the red, 118.0, 118.025, 118.050, and so forth. We've now spaced them by 8.33 kilohertz, and that's what you're seeing there in the green column, which then translates to the one circled in blue. There's a lot more detail that goes into that, but that's the basics of it. If your aircraft is equipped with an HF radio, that would be mostly used for traveling long distances over oceans or other areas where it's a long distance between transceivers, because HF radios have much greater of a range, but they're also much more staticky. They're much more difficult and labor intensive to listen to for that entire length of time. So they're not used except for very long range operations, and they operate in the 3,000 to 30,000 kilohertz range, rather than the 118 to 136 megahertz range. So if your aircraft has an HF radio, you can indicate that with the letter H. In terms of nav radios, your D indicates that you have a DME receiver. Your F indicates that you have an automatic direction finder or an ADF receiver. Letter O indicates that you have a VOR receiver. Again, it's in purple. Why? We'll come back to it. And then the letter L indicates that you have an ILS receiver. Again, purple. We'll come back to it. In terms of your RNAV capability, we've got the letter I, which indicates an inertial nav or an inertial reference system. We've got the letter G, which indicates GNSS. That's basically the same thing as saying that it's GPS equipped. Letter B indicates that your aircraft is LPV capable. What's that mean? That means that your RNAV receiver is precise enough that it can give you lateral and vertical guidance on an approach. Only the most modern and precise versions of your inertial nav systems, GPS systems, are able to do that, and you indicate that capability with the letter B there. The letter R here means that you have a system that meets some sort of performance-based navigation standards, and oh boy, is that a topic. We're going to come back to that one. And then the letter Z means some sort of other RNAV capability that isn't specified by one of these letters already. Again, the red ones, kind of like the purple ones, we're going to come back to, but that basically means that we've got more information that we're going to have to put into these later fields, which, as I mentioned, are optional on VATSIM. Now, two more quick codes to go over. is if you are capable of operating in RVSM airspace, which is between flight level 290 and flight level 410, then you put a W. And again, if you aren't sure what RVSM is, I kind of cover it in the FAA equipment code tutorial if you want to go check that out and then come back to us here. But basically, more or less, if you're capable of flying at flight level 290 or higher, you go ahead and put a W there. There's more to it than that in the real world, but in terms of VATSIM, that's a simple enough definition. And then if you put an S, now we're coming back to those purple ones there. If you put a letter S, that's basically the same thing as saying I got the V, I got the O, I got the L. You just put the S instead, and you can omit putting those other letters in there. All right, let's talk transponder codes. There's three main types of transponders, which we'll review here real quick for you. The mode A is the transponder that's got that 4-digit code that you have to dial in to identify yourself. So it's a 4-digit code, and they're encoded in 3 bits, meaning that only the digits 0 through 7 are possible. So that's mode A. If your transponder has that 4-digit code that you have to dial in, that's mode A. If you have that, plus the ability to report your altitude to air traffic control, that's mode C, mode Charlie, aka squawk altitude. They're telling you to activate your altitude reporting mode. So that's your mode Charlie. And then the third type, more modern type, is your mode S. That's a newer type of transponder that's able to identify you digitally in a method that doesn't require you to put in a code. And it also has the capability of reporting other information to air traffic controllers, telemetry information such as your heading, your speed, your vertical descent or climb rate. So just basically a more modern and more capable system. It's not fully simulated on VATSIM yet, but most of your modern airliners, actually even many of your modern general aviation planes, are now Mode S transponder equipped. So commonly on VATSIM, the codes that you would see in the transponder surveillance equipment type would be C, which would be your Mode C. Pilot clients include this functionality, so even if a Mode C transponder is not modeled in your aircraft, you technically have it on VATSIM by virtue of the pilot client itself that simulates the Mode C functionality. But you could put an S here that would indicate that you have a Mode S transponder, and this assumes a Mode S transponder that has the capability of reporting your aircraft ID and the altitude. Some of them don't have it, but those are not terribly common. And then L is your Mode S with some extended squitter, and I'm not even going to go into what an extended squitter and advanced surveillance is. But again, we're at the point now where most modern airliners do have this equipment, so most of the time you're going to put an L there if you were a modern airliner. Less common codes are exactly what I was just saying, which is that these are the letters that represent that you have Mode S, but you don't have aircraft ID, or you don't have altitude reporting, you've got one or the other, or you have neither, blah, blah, blah. Those letters are really not that common, but there they are in case you want to dive into them. All right, now let's get into the last part here. We've got 16 fields at the bottom of this flight plan page that we haven't really talked about. They're completely optional. You don't have to put a darn thing in any of these. However, I know there's going to be a handful of you out there that really want to know what's supposed to go in there, just in case I want to do it exactly perfectly. So we're going to dive into that here. All right, first let's talk performance-based navigation. We talked about this in just a few light terms earlier, but it's the idea that in terms of the FAA, you're either RNAV capable or you're not. But in reality, as the systems get better and more capable, there's not one size fits all in terms of what your RNAV capable aircraft can or can't do. So this is now a much more specific way of describing your aircraft and avionics capabilities. And this is the web page that I used as a reference for the information here. Now, most common avionics packages for aircraft flown on VATSIM are certified B2, C2, and D2. If you want the details on what all that translates to, you can go ahead and hit that link up there. I'll put it in the video description for you as well. But it basically indicates that your aircraft is capable of flying an RNAV SID and an RNAV star. Additionally, the S1, if you put that, indicates that you're able to do a GPS approach with LNAV minimums. And S2 indicates that you're able to do an RNAV GPS approach with LNAV and VNAV minimums. I'm going to show you the difference. On some charts, it's specific as to what the minimums are, depending on what your aircraft is capable of. So it's important that you know what your aircraft's capable of in terms of providing that vertical guidance, and therefore you know what minimums are appropriate for you to use for that approach. And then finally, a T1 indicates that your aircraft is capable of performing an approach that includes one of those curved approach paths defined by what they call radius to fix, or RF legs. All right, the second field is marked NAV, and it simply refers to other navigation capability. Here's the reference link that you can use for the information on this page. This RNAV example shows that you are RNAV D1, E2, A1. And what that means is that during the departure phase, you're able to meet RNAV 1 specification. During the en route phase, for whatever reason, your equipment's not as precise and can only meet RNAV 2 specifications. But then in the approach phase, you are once again able to meet RNAV 1 specifications during your arrival. This situation is not really common anymore, but here's the code that you'd use in case you would want to specify that. Next is the field called DAT. This is Data Communication Capabilities. And here's the page that we use to come up with this information for you. It refers to the very specific type of text capability that your aircraft might have. If you have a future air navigation system, this is what they call Controller Pilot Data Link Communications, or CPDLC. If you are able to receive a pre-departure clearance via your ACARS system, then you can put that, or if you must receive your clearance by voice, you can put that. And what you do is you put a number before each, indicating your order of preference. How do you prefer your clearance? If you want the CPDLC first priority, but you will also be willing to accept via ACARS as a backup plan, then you can put 1 FANS, 2 PDC, and that specifies your preference in that regard. Next is the field marked SIR. This is other surveillance capabilities. Here's another web link to where some of this information is, and it allows you to specify whether your MODES transponder transmits only, either sends your position to air traffic control, or can it also receive positions from other aircraft around you. And then it also indicates which specific radio and data band your S transponder communicates on. No one's looking at this on VATSIM. It is perfectly acceptable to leave this blank. DOF, very simply, data filing. Well, look at that. It's going to automatically fill itself in. So you know what? Leave it alone. Next field's marked REG, R-E-G. That is your aircraft registration. Now, if you're flying general aviation, usually the call sign and the registration are going to be the same. You're just going to use the tail number of the plane as your call sign. However, it's also possible that you'll file your general aviation flight through a filing service like ForeFlight, and you get a call sign of FFT and your flight number, or Flightplan.com, and you get a flight plan that's assigned to you in terms of a .com call sign, DCM, and your randomly assigned flight number. So in that case, or the case of a commercial air carrier where you have a carrier ID and flight number as your call sign, you might want to put the plane's tail number in this REG field. Go ahead, knock yourself out. SEL, okay, all right. Well, that is your selective calling, aka your SELCAL. This is really not that pertinent to you unless you're crossing an ocean. If you look at some of our Flight Sim Association pilot briefing webinars that we've done for the Cross the Pond event, we go into a little bit more of a detailed description about how SELCAL works. I'm going to give you the real quick version here. So again, I apologize for the pace. It's a lot to cover, but the other briefings are maybe potentially good resources for you if you really want to understand SELCAL. Okay. Over the ocean, you're using HF radios, which operate in the 3,000 to 30,000 kilohertz range instead of your regular VHF radios. Why is that? Because they've got much longer range, but they've got terrible sound quality, and a lot of times you're listening to constant static, waiting for the voice buried in that static to be calling you. So in order to make it easier to use those radios, there's a paging system called SELCAL, or selective calling. It's used to alert pilots that the controller needs to contact them. It is enacted with a set of 2 tones, two pairs of 2 tones actually, that are designated with letter pairs. So you have Alpha Bravo, Charlie Delta, for the sake of an example. They use 16 different letters, Alpha through Sierra, but they don't use India, November, or Oscar. And each letter can only appear once in the code. Then within each pair, the tones are simultaneous. So AB is basically the same as BA. So for that reason, they always just list it as alphabetically AB. Now on VATSIM, You really only need this if you're crossing oceanic airspace. If you're not, you can leave this blank. Generally speaking, you can make up a code as long as it's a valid code, but during bigger events, such as cross the pond, a SALCAL code will be assigned to you, so you do have to use that. When you do, the SALCAL code that you list in your flight plan has to match the one that you entered when you connected with your pilot client. You've got to put the same code in twice, once when you connect, once when you file. Just like your call sign, it's got to match exactly. All right, the next field is marked simply code. This is your Mode S identification code. It's basically like a MAC address of your Mode S transponder. We said it's a digital means of identifying yourself. In the real world, it would be on the box somewhere. VATSIM, no one cares, just leave it blank. RVR, this is an interesting one. This stands for Runway Visual Range, and it's the same RVR that would appear in a METAR in case there's very low visibility, and then there's an RVR value that indicates exactly how many feet down the runway were observable during the most recent METAR observation. It might be in feet, might be in meters, depending on the location. Now, certain real-world companies don't allow their crews to accept an approach clearance if the RVR is below a certain level, even if it's above the minimums. So let's say the RVR is 800 meters, but the minimums are 600 meters. So it's legal, but your company says you can't accept an approach that's any less than 900 meters. Well, this would be the field that you would specify that value if it applied to you. Now, on VATSIM, there's nobody enforcing this. So unless you're really strictly operating under the SOP of a real-world company that you're emulating the flight of, you can pretty much ignore this. OPR, this stands for operator, and it's basically just the name of the company that you're flying for. And again, similar to what we did earlier with the RTF, the radio telephony, really it's going to correspond with the ICAO identifier that you used at the beginning of your call sign, but sometimes it is helpful to fill this in if it's a company that's not universally known, or it's no longer in operation, or it's fictional. But again, the RTF, what you call that flight over the radio, may not be the name of the operator, so sometimes you might have to specify both. Next is PER, performance, and this means approach performance category. This is the approach category that's used on your instrument approach procedure to determine which set of minimums you should be following. So this should be relatively familiar to you if you are used to looking at those instrument approach procedures and the various categories of minimums. So there's nothing new here. This is just where you can specify in your flight plan which of these categories you're going to fall under in terms of your aircraft's VREF speed. RALT, this is another interesting one, and I will confess that I'm not real knowledgeable on this, but this refers to your en route alternate, and this is about ETOPS planning. And this is, again, I don't fly a lot of long hauls. I don't do much transoceanic flying except for on the cross the pond events, but this really refers to your extended twin jet operations performance standards planning, ETOPS planning. It's a set of requirements that you have to meet when you're crossing large distances devoid of safe landing areas, such as oceans. And part of that requirement is that you plan for en route diversion sites that are within a certain number of minutes of your route as you go. And they have various categories of ETOPS certification, ETOPS 60 or 120 or 180 and so forth. So this would allow you to specify RALT/ the ICAO of one or more airports that you would plan to divert to if you encountered some sort of an emergency or lost an engine while you were over the ocean. TALT, this is another one that's really interesting in terms of emergency planning that we don't tend to think about much on VATSIM, but it's takeoff alternate. And if you had a situation where you're taking off from an airport where the weather is really, really bad, you want to plan ahead for what happens if I pass V1 and I have to go airborne, but I've got some sort of safety critical issue that I need an immediate return to the airport. But the weather at my airport was bad enough that I was legal to take off, but I'm not legal to land. Well, this is where you might specify a takeoff alternate, a very nearby airport that's got runways of sufficient length that you can land safely and that have weather sufficient for you to make that approach and land safely. So this is where you would specify your takeoff alternate in the event that you're departing from somewhere where there's really, really bad weather. Origin, well, this is not the origin that you're taking off from. We covered that in the top part of the flight plan. This is your flight plan originator. It indicates where the flight plan was filed from. On VATSIM, really that could mean something like SimBrief, but if you're filling out the flight plan by hand, just leave it blank. Getting down to the last couple here, your COM. This is your other communication capability. Again, here's a web link to where I came up with the information that goes in this field. You really don't need to put these into VATSIM. There are codes E1 through E3 and codes J1 through J7 which specify exactly which type of CPDLC or ACARS your aircraft is equipped with. If you really, really want to know that information, you can go look it up, but on VATSIM, no one's looking at it. Finally, your EET, your estimated entry time. This is the estimated time in terms of Zulu that the aircraft is going to cross into each new control facility. Filing services like SimBrief is going to automatically include these. And we've taken a snip here from our BWI to Boston plan, and we see right here that the estimated time to enter the New York ARTCC is 0018 Zulu, and then the estimated time to enter Boston ARTCC's airspace is 0028 Zulu. So your SimBrief and your other online planning tools are automatically going to include these. You don't need to calculate them by hand and put them in. Nobody on VATSIM's looking at these. Well, friends, that's going to conclude our tutorial on the web-based flight plan filing on the VATSIM network. So we hope you found it useful, maybe even learned a thing or two. But if you have any questions about anything that you saw or heard, go ahead and leave those right down there in the comments, or find us over on the Slant Alpha Adventures Discord server or any of our social media outlets. We hope to hear you and see you in the VATSIM skies sometime soon. But in the meantime, be healthy and safe on all your own travels and adventures. Take care.